Morning, kiddos. Today we are going to be talking about domain and range. So domain and range are two concepts that we have discussed briefly before. We went over the definitions. Remember that domain goes with our x values and range goes with our y values when we're talking about ordered pairs, particularly when we're looking at a graph. So to remind you of the definitions, when you're looking at domain, if you have a set of ordered pairs, domain would be the set of all x coordinates. You can think about domain as inputs. They're the values that go into the function. Range would be the set of all the y coordinates. You could think of range as the output. Those are the values that come out of the function. So as you can see in the picture below, domain, the values I'm plugging in for x into the function of x squared. So when I plug in 1, 2, and 3 into x squared, 1, 4, and 9 are the values that pop out. Those are my outputs. So domain and range are also associated with input and output. Okay. Now, really easy concept to work with. We're going to be going over 3 skills today. So the 3 skills that we're talking about are how do we write domain and range when we're given a set of ordered pairs? How do we look at a mapping and then write our coordinates, looking at domain and range and then converting it back into coordinates? And then how can we look at graphs and determine domain and range from a graph? Okay, so our first skill, let's jump into it, writing domain and range. So when we write domain and range based on ordered pairs, there are 2 things we have to remember. The first is that we always want to write things in order of value from least to greatest. So when we look at our coordinate pairs, they're not necessarily in any order. So when we write domain and range, we do want to put things in order from least to greatest. The second thing we have to remember is that for the purposes of what we're going to be doing later, we don't want to write any repeats. Okay, so if a value occurs more than once in the domain, we don't write it more than once. We only write it one time, same for the range. Okay, so let's jump into this. So remember, domain is associated with our x values. Our x values are going to be the first number in our ordered pairs. Okay, so we have 2, -1, 2, and 0. In order from least to greatest, we're going to start with -1. And then we have 0, and then we have +2. Now, +2 happens twice, but again, we only write it one time. We don't have to write the second time down. Even if there were 7 2s, we would only write one of them down when we're considering domain, because domain is all the possible values for x. And 2 is a possible value, but you don't have to write it multiple times. Range, again, is associated with our y values. So remember, y is the second value in the ordered pair. So our possible y values, we have 3, 0, -5, and -3. Again, we're going to write them in order from least to greatest. So I start with -5. Then I have -3. Then I have 0 and +3. It is completely okay for the values to be different, meaning that you don't have to have the same amount in the set of the domain as you do in the set of the range. So even though there's only 3 elements in the domain, it's completely okay to have more than 3 elements in the range. In fact, that will mean something specific later in the chapter. If there are more elements in one or the other, we know something about the actual set of ordered pairs. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this skill. Let's practice one more. Let's do one more example. So here is another set of ordered pairs. Again, we're going to write our domain and our range. So domain, those are our x values. I'm just going to go through and mark these to make sure that we take these all into account. Okay, x first value in the ordered pair. So I have 3, -3, 7, -8, and 0. So if I'm going to least to greatest, I have -8. I'm going to underline that so I know that I've taken it into account. Then I have -3. Then I have 0. Then I have 3. And lastly, I have 7. Okay. Now, going into range, again, range are my y values. Just going to write this out so I remember which values I'm looking at. Okay. Possible y values, I have 7, 7, -2, -5, -1. So in order from least to greatest, we're starting with that -5. Then we have -2. Then I have -1. And then 7 happens twice, but I only have to account for it once. So 7. Okay. Really simple. 2 things to remember. Again, always put the numbers in order from least to greatest, and then you only want to account for numbers once, even if they happen multiple times. Okay. Now, moving forward, our next skill, we're going to be talking about something called mapping. So mapping is the idea that the domain and the range are already separated out. We have our x's listed, we have our y's listed. But the mapping is the line that connects the element in the domain to the element in the range. So if you look, for example, at -1 right here, which is in the domain, it's an x value, and then you follow the line that connects it to something in the range right here, +2. So those being connected by that line is telling you what the actual coordinate is. So those two have a connection, and that point would be -1, 2 if I were to go back and write the coordinate pair. Okay. So we're just going to go through this list, and we are going to write down all of the coordinate pairs based on the relationship of the mapping. So of course we'll start with that first one, which we just discovered, which was -1, 2. And then we're working our way down the elements in the domain, so down the x's. So the next one we have 0, and 0 is connected to +2. Then you have 1, and 1 is connected to -3. And then you have 2, and 2 is connected to -2. And then you have 8, and 8 is connected to 3. Okay. So you can always go back and make sure you have all the ordered pairs by counting the lines you see. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines, and I have 5 ordered pairs, so we know we got all of those down. Okay, pretty easy skill. Now our last skill for today is we're going to look at domain and range from a graph. So whenever you're thinking of domain and range from a graph, it's important to remember what our coordinate plane looks like. So we have a graph that looks like this. Okay. Domain is your x values. So domain goes with x values, and we know that the x-axis is the one that goes from left to right. Okay, so our x-axis is here. It goes from the left side to the right side. Okay. Now, range is associated with our y values, and range goes from the bottom to the top. Okay. Again, that's our y-axis, so our y-axis is here, goes from the bottom to the top. So when we're thinking about domain and range,